Good afternoon. Your attention, please. No, good afternoon. We begin the third session today. I'll be very, very brief. I only have one question, probably for the Italian or European contingency, and that is that migration has taken place since ancient times, prehistory times. But what bothers us today is not necessarily the migration that migrate for economic reasons, but rather for the wars that we are created. And I was thinking that perhaps someone today or tomorrow could talk about the link between war and the migratory problems that are being created, which are really very, very, yeah.
You're saying the word
war.
Migration has created war.
No, not to end the war. Migration link. You link together the two because war has very much to do, or immigration has to do very much with war. So I was hoping that the European side would talk about this subject, because I think it's the most dramatic and tragic event that we are living today, and not necessarily because of economic reasons. Migration, as Professor Mignoni said, it's forced migration. They are running away from something, and I think we should talk about it. We have three speakers today. The first speaker will be Tiffany Joseph, who is an assistant professor of sociology and an affiliate faculty Latin American Caribbean Studies at Stony Brook University. She recently explores comparative frameworks of race migration in the Americas and micro-level impact on macro-level public policies. Her current project examines the immigrants' health care access under the Affordable Care Act. The second speaker is Claudio Rossi, a sociologist, has been working since 1992 on policies for the integration of immigrant communities. He's a co-founder of a special immigration office in the municipality of Rome, Italy, where he has been involved in designing and programming of integrated services for immigration population, and he has done that for many years. He specializes in matters relating to the representation of foreign citizenship, and as a member of the Co-RIS Immigration Observatory at La Sapienza University in Rome, he has several master's degrees. And the last speaker is Sonia Diaz Inoa, Esquire. She's a PhD in democratic society, specifically for the state and the law, from the University of del País Vasco. She holds a master's degree in human rights protection from the University, La Universidad de Alcalá de Henares, both from Spain. She also holds a master's degree in public administration and a law degree, both received from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Madre y Maestra of Santo Domingo. She's a research professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo in the subject of administration law and penitentiary law, and has a working experience in the state's area or the government's area. At the theoretical level, she works in the matter of migration, human rights, and gender. She is a practicing lawyer and a volunteer in the civic movement named Participación Ciudadana. And now Tiffany Joseph.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out to the conference today. It's certainly been one that I've learned a lot from. All right, so what I'll be talking about today is a project that I've been working on for the last few years, looking at issues of healthcare access for immigrants under inclusive state-level reforms, like the one in Massachusetts, which was the first state in the U.S. to have comprehensive health reform for all of its residents. And so I've been looking at how the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, has reshifted the healthcare system in terms of access to coverage for immigrants living in the state of Massachusetts. So before we get started, I think it's important to focus on or have some background information on public policy in the United States in various realms and how that's had an impact on what people have access to based on their documentation status currently in the United States. So first of all, it's really important to start with immigration policy. In 1996, Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, also known as IRERA, and this was the last type of comprehensive reform passed by the U.S. government in terms of immigration. So this was over 20 years ago now. And in terms of this particular policy, the purpose of it was for individuals to have to verify their employment eligibility or ability to work legally in the U.S. It also focused on enhancing border security, but also it criminalized the process of using fraudulent documents. So for instance, if you had access to a false Social Security number, that became a crime to do that. The same year, in terms of welfare policy, Congress also passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. And even though this is considered a welfare policy, it had a very important immigration component. And essentially what it did was it said that if you had a green card in the United States or you were a legal permanent resident, you had to be here for 5 years before you were eligible for any sort of public benefits from the U.S. government. So what this meant was that if you were a green card holder here paying your taxes and working, but you had not yet met that 5-year bar, you were ineligible for Medicaid, Social Security, or Medicare. The other impact of this law in terms of immigrants is that it also made it other immigrants of other documentation statuses ineligible for federal benefits. So a lot of times in the media there is these large misconceptions disseminated about undocumented immigrants being able to access Medicaid and other types of public benefits. And actually that's not true, because in terms of this policy here, even up to legal tax-paying immigrants, unless you've been here with the green card for 5 years, are ineligible for federal benefits. And so this is really important in terms of thinking about how documentation status can shape access to health care and other benefits within the United States context. And then lastly, because of these prior two policies, when it comes to the area of health policy, documentation status also plays a very important role in shaping access to things like Medicaid and Medicare. And so even going up to the 2010 Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, most immigrants are ineligible for any benefits under the ACA at the federal level because of these 1996 reforms that were passed and are still being currently used in the United States. Depending on where you live in the U.S., there are some states where immigrants, regardless of documentation status, if they have a certain income level, are eligible to apply for coverage that's partially state funded, but at the federal level, they're ineligible for federal programs. And so today I'll be talking about how there's this distinction between state level reforms, such as the ones in Massachusetts, but also how that compares to federal level reforms. So here in this chart is essentially an outline of how documentation status, or where you fall in terms of documentation statuses that it currently exists under U.S. law, how they shape what sorts of health coverage options you have access to. So don't worry about reading all of the details. What I want to point out is that these two charts here, or these two columns here, refer to the Massachusetts reform that existed. And in the state of Massachusetts, before the Affordable Care Act or before Obamacare was implemented, and even after, if you had a certain income level or below a certain income level, you are eligible for some sort of coverage in the state of Massachusetts, regardless of what your documentation status was. Whether you're undocumented, you're on temporary protected status, depending on what type of visa you had, if you were a green card holder, and then also a naturalized citizen. You had access to some sort of coverage in the state, at least funded by the state of Massachusetts. Compared to the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare in other states, because of those 1996 provisions, you're essentially ineligible for most forms of the ACA provisions unless you're here under temporary protected status, and then you as a green card holder. Again, these distinctions are based on federal law. So that's the most important thing to remember. If you live in a state like Massachusetts and you're an immigrant and have a certain income level, you're eligible for some type of coverage from the state that's funded by the state. And I want to emphasize, you're not eligible for any federal benefits, though. So that the state-federal level distinction is really important to remember in the context of Massachusetts, but also as we think about Obamacare and other parts of the United States. And so in terms of moving forward and talking more specifically about the context of Massachusetts, where I've been focusing my research for the last 6 years. So some of the coverage determinants there are certainly income. So you have to meet a certain income threshold or fall beneath a certain income level to be eligible for some types of coverage within the state of Massachusetts. But also, even though documentation status is, people regardless of documentation status in Massachusetts have access to some coverage, different types of documentation status determine what type of coverage you're eligible for within the state of Massachusetts. So for people who have lower income levels and are not eligible for federal level, federally covered programs like Medicaid, for instance, or Medicare, you would be eligible for the state level program, the Health Safety Net in the state of Massachusetts. And this is at the bottom of the pyramid because you can only use this type of coverage in certain parts or in certain healthcare facilities in the state that have to be Health Safety Net designated. What this means is that your options in terms of where you can go and use that coverage are limited. So you have access to coverage, but you might not have access to a wide range of providers where you can get that coverage to go actually get healthcare services. And then moving up the pyramid as you have more income level and also as your documentation status improves. So as you become a green card holder, but you're a green card holder here with 5 years and you're a citizen, you have access to a wider range of health insurance options within the state of Massachusetts. And these health insurance options also are more likely to be used by other types of providers. So for instance, with Medicaid in most parts of the United States, physicians can actually opt out of seeing Medicaid patients. But if you have private insurance, you have far more options at your disposal for being able to see healthcare providers that will take that coverage. And so what we find, even in a case like Massachusetts, where there is inclusive health reform for individuals, that your income level and your documentation status entitle people to different forms of health coverage within the healthcare system. And this is what researcher Donald calls categorically unequal access to health care. So in terms of thinking about a lot of the research that's been done, or some of the research that's been done looking at immigrants' barriers to health care in the United States, documentation status is a huge one, and I've already outlined that a little bit in terms of talking about the Massachusetts case, and how documentation status, especially if you're undocumented, limits your access to various types of health care services in the U.S. And one of the misconceptions as well in terms of thinking about documentation status is that even if you're a documented or a citizen, that you might be less affected by these things, which is the case if everyone else in your family is also a citizen. But if you're in a mixed status family and you're a legal immigrant who may be trying to apply for other people to come to the U.S., your use of public services and certain services in the United States could have an impact on your ability to be able to legalize the status of other family members that might want to come to the United States. And so this is is tied to this notion of this concept called public charge in the United States, where if an individual or an immigrant, I should say, is going to be considered public charge or someone who's going to cost the government money, this could have an impact on their ability to to legalize their status in the future, and also that of their family members in the United States. Another barrier to health care also significantly that's tied to documentation status, or in addition to documentation status, are issues of language, ethnicity, and culture. And so, for instance, not having the proper language skills to be able to communicate and complete enrollment paperwork for healthcare services in the United States. Also, cultural differences between the U.S. healthcare system compared to the healthcare system in the country of origin, and then also issues of racism and implicit bias that immigrants of color experience in the United States also play a role in facilitating these barriers to care. And then finally, we have to talk about something called bureaucratic disentitlement, which is a process in which if individuals are eligible to apply for coverage, they might not fully be able to actually make use of those services because of things like difficulty with the re-enrollment process. If your first language or primary language of use is Spanish or Portuguese and all the paperwork you have to fill out is in English, you're going to have a difficult time signing up for coverage even though you're eligible for it living in the state of Massachusetts. And so briefly, I just want to talk now about the methods that I've been using to look at this particular issue for the last few years. So for this project, I conducted a series of semi-structured interviews in 2012 to 2013 before Obamacare was implemented in the state of Massachusetts under the state's original health care reform, which some people refer to as Romney Care because it was implemented under Governor Mitt Romney. And so I wanted to find out if you're an immigrant living in the state under that original reform, did you have access to some sort of coverage, and what were your experiences navigating the healthcare system? So I interviewed a series of immigrants or groups of immigrants to find out what their experiences were, and these are 3 of the largest immigrant groups in Boston. There are also 3 of the large Latino groups in the city as well. I also wanted to find out from the provider perspective, how has this health policy shifted your ability to provide care for your immigrant patients? And then lastly, what else is happening within the context of Boston that might be shaping people's access to health care that's not directly tied to health policy? So if there have been ICE raids, for instance, in a community, how might that affect people's willingness to seek out health care? And so I interviewed people from different immigrant and health advocacy organizations. And I also conducted a series of interviews after the ACA was implemented to see how the shift from Romney Care to Obamacare had an impact on the healthcare system and how immigrants could access health services within that context. So this is just more demographic information. I can answer more about these in the Q&A if you have more questions, but I'm just going to go through these and get to the findings. So first of all, one of the biggest things that came up in my study in terms of looking at the role of documentation status was that the intersection of different types of policies actually limits healthcare access. So you have the intersection between immigration policy, health and welfare policies, and I illustrated that in terms of talking about the 3 policies in terms of the 1996 reforms, and how these intersections across these different policy realms have an impact on determining people's eligibility for different types of coverage. Additionally, it's also, we have to consider the intersection of local, state, and federal level reforms, and how you might be included at the state and the local level, but excluded when it comes to federal policies like Obamacare. So you really have to think about how these policies intersect with each other and have an impact on shaping people's healthcare access. And then additionally, when you have shifts or changes in policy, so for instance, moving from the original Massachusetts reform to Obamacare, which is more exclusive for immigrants compared to the state level reform, created a lot of confusion in the state for immigrant populations as they tried to figure out, what am I eligible for, even though I live here in the state of Massachusetts as a resident. And so here is just one of the quotes from someone that I interviewed in the Boston mayor's office about a couple of years ago now. And she talks about how this intersection between between these different policies has an impact on immigrant populations. So first she says, if you're undocumented, it's very hard to get any amount of services that come through federal dollars because of those policy restrictions. The policies are already set, and we have to know what they are and be able to navigate people. And then here she talks about how in the state of Massachusetts, which now has a GOP governor, and then the city of Boston, which has a Democratic governor, the governor has stances that are very different from that of the more progressive mayor of Boston, and how when it comes to immigration issues, this leads them to often be on opposite sides of an issue. And so this has an impact on immigrant residents living in the state and living in the city of Boston in terms of what particular policies end up getting passed. So here is just a little bit more information about the Health Safety Net program in Massachusetts. And so this is the program that if you're an immigrant or a resident, Massachusetts resident of any documentation status, as long as you have a certain income level, you're eligible for this. What I just want to quickly point out is that after I finished my field work in 2016, Massachusetts decided to completely eliminate its budget for this program. And so the impact of it is that there is now reduced coverage under this program for immigrants in the state who were ineligible for other types of federally funded health care, but also other low-income residents who were citizens or eligible for other types of coverage. This also reduced their coverage through this program. And so the implication is that the end of this, or not the end of this program, but reduced state committed funding to this program has had an impact on the populations that were able to benefit from it before. One of the other things that came up in the study was this perception that using local healthcare services could increase someone's deportation risk. And this goes back to this notion of the public charge that I mentioned before that's tied to those 1996 policies that Congress implemented. And there was also a perception among some of the immigrants that I interviewed that if you didn't pay for medical services or health services, that ICE could come to your house and deport you just for not paying your medical bills. So this created a lot of concern for people. They really thought that there was a connection between the healthcare system, healthcare facilities, and then Immigration, Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Homeland Security. As at the time that I completed this research, that was not the case, and there certainly started to be more information or stories in the news about this notion of sanctuary hospitals, and if ICE comes to hospitals, should they have the ability to arrest people within those contexts. And so one of the Brazilian immigrants that I interviewed talked about how whenever she went to the doctor, she thought that if she didn't pay, that she would be deported. She said, I thought the police would go to my house and deport me. When you are illegal, you are afraid. You do not know that Homeland Security is not attached to the healthcare system. And so this ended up playing a role in minimizing her access to healthcare, because if she got sick, she was afraid to go to the doctor because it would create bills, and then she thought she could get deported for not being able to afford to pay those bills. The last thing that I want to mention too is that in terms of thinking about immigration enforcement, this is a really, really huge one, and it does have an impact on immigrants' health. Not only in terms of the fear of ICE, or fear of immigrant raids, but a lot of times this could lead to either delayed care or no care at all, where people make the decision to stay at home, especially if there have been immigration raids in their neighborhoods the night before they're supposed to go to an appointment. Another thing that came up in my study was this notion of how the changing social climate at the national level is having an impact at the local level, creating a lot of fear, even in what's considered to be a progressive context like Boston. So what's happening nationally does have a local impact. And then the implications of mental health in terms of people being stressed out, living in fear about being pulled over by police, being deported by ICE. This leads to loss of sleep, and so mental health is also impacted by this. And so one of the social workers that I interviewed, one of the healthcare providers I interviewed, she talks about how they've had issues with patients who are facing deportation because they got pulled over are on their way to the healthcare facility for a doctor's or a medical appointment. And so she refers to when there were a lot of raids happening, and there was actually a patient that was coming to the clinic and said, I'm not going to make it today because I saw a police car, so I'm turning around and going home. And so this is another way in which this notion of immigration enforcement in terms of being undocumented or either being racialized as undocumented leads people to, has an impact on the health of immigrants. So to conclude, I'd just like to say that exclusive intersecting policies can minimize the impact of local inclusive policies like the inclusive health policy in Massachusetts. The intersection and concerns about increasing anti-immigrant sentiment reduces immigrants' healthcare access. And the other issue is that policies continue to shift, and we've certainly been seeing this a lot under the current administration, where there are these new executive orders and policy initiatives that continue to be introduced, and on the ground, this really creates a lot of confusion within healthcare and other types of institutions for individuals. Also, we have to think about the role of the intersection between legal de jure discrimination on the basis of documentation status and how people are excluded on the basis of that, but how that intersects with de facto forms or more informal forms of exclusion, particularly when you think about populations or immigrants of color who comprise a large percentage of immigrants in the United States. And then also to just think about international comparisons given the context that we're in. Massachusetts is not the only state or context where these issues of trying to figure out who has access to what is an issue, but also Canada and Western Europe have also been grappling with these issues too, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm all out of time, but if people want to ask me about how I think the shifting policy regimes under this current administration might have some impact on what's happening in Boston, I'll also be happy to talk about that. Thank you.
The second speaker is Claudio Rossi from the University of La Sapienza in Rome.
Good evening to all. Thank you, Professor Mignone, because the possibility of discuss on the citizenship. The concept of citizenship conforms the sphere of a society that participates in, regulates, and carries out the sense of mutual relationships and of the organization of groups of individuals as they are recognized in that society. It indicates the greater common interests which call for supportive behavior among citizens. The concept of citizenship, therefore, doesn't simply represent a legal procedure, but it is a cultural product that concerns the profound motivation of the sentiment of sharing the society that expresses it. We will also see that in every place and time, the sense of citizenship represented for human communities a way to interpret the system of relationships between the members of a community and between themselves and outsiders, the others, and the foreigners, those who are not part of that community. For this reason, the sense of citizenship accompanied the evolution of human society, defining time and time again who is part of the people and how they are a part of it, the purposes of assuring its own survival. The function of citizenship moves like a pendulum between union and separation, parity and discrimination, participation and exclusion, referring to both citizens and non-citizens. In discussing citizenship, therefore, it is fundamental to understand that it can be utilized for opposite purposes. We around 30,500 before Christ, when the first civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt established the first cities. We then organized interviewing of relation, division of task and work, and rules of coexistence. In this phase, the potential citizens are those who permanently live in the territory subject to the dominion of the city, exercised by the authority of a king or commander whose legitimacy of power they recognize. Generally, this territory is surrounded and protected by large walls, which defend its citizens from enemies and simultaneously separates the community from all others. They are citizens, however, not everyone who lives inside the walls, only those who are considered free, in comparison to slaves and prisoners. The citizens have the ability to make decisions. The slaves, prisoners, foreigners, and everyone who doesn't permanently live in the city do not. Already from the beginning, then, the sense of the citizenship presents its fundamental meanings: identification of a status of a membership, the definition of the condition of mutual parity, and the determination of the capability of sharing. It in any case in classical Greece that we Westerners traditionally put the origin of the philosophical political definition of citizenship. Due to how is born, the Greek city is territorially limited and must continuously contend with cities bordering the area of security relating to mobility, production, trade, but also cultural and political management. The concept of the Greek polis is a concept in itself elitist. It is nothing other than the place in which the elite, composed of the city's founders and their descendants, practice politics. The citizen is not a part of the polis. They are the polis, and therefore the power to participate in its government, more than a civil right, is understood as a privilege that concerns the elite. Attention to privilege and to social separation pushed the Greeks to be extremely reluctant to grant citizenship. For example, in Athens, where only adult males and Athenian descendants could be considered citizens with political rights. The elite originated in the area encircled by the walls. They did not come to the city from abroad. This gives them the natural right of superiority, contrary to other members of the society. A belief that produced a refusal of integration of the immigrant and foreign population in all of the Greek world. If citizenship is a privilege, then it is defended. This concept of citizenship lasted as long as the culture of the polis, which at a certain point dissolved within a new culture that changed the interpretation of the city, citizens, and therefore citizenship. The diffusion of the sophist philosophical doctrine and the open and tolerant environment incited by Alexander the Great's conquest in the 4th century before Christ opened the doors to Hellenism. The two new driving cultural premises of the Hellenistic revolution: all men are equal, apart from political and social characterization. And if everyone is equal, then it is possible they may equally be part of a single people. The sense of citizenship is transformed from a selective and discriminatory tool to a container of universality. The idea incited by Alexander the Great is, in fact, a society of a universal foundation with a common language, religion, and culture, within which one, as much as being human, can feel like a citizen. Knocking down the political and economic barriers between cities, population growth and diversification, and the development of a associative life are the new characteristics of the Hellenistic city. It is now seen as a center of culture rather than a type of state, in which the integration of difference no longer causes fear, but rather is a condition of citizenship. While Alexander the Great was pushing his influence east, the great power of Rome was emerging in the Western Mediterranean. However, let us quickly mention that regarding the current debate on granting citizenship. The appearance of the duality between ius sanguinis and ius soli is not a part of the Roman political culture, but is introduced much later by medieval jurists of the 12th century. Rome's originality instead lies in the conceiving an idea of a citizenship that is not rigid and static, but justified in adapting to the society's social and political changes from time to time. The foundation of the city of Rome was the product of the blend and balance of early Sabine, Etruscan, and Latin communities with an original varied social composition: farmers, breeders, merchants, freemen, but also servants, rebels, and exiles from neighboring cities. The Roman citizens maintained this awareness of original being mixed people. The awareness fostered openness to the integration of diversities on an ethical, social, and cultural level according to the effectiveness of coexistence. An important awareness because the problem the Romans always faced was how to manage the continuous assimilation of human communities caused by continuous territorial expansion in an orderly and productive way. Throughout the history, the Romans used the concession of Roman citizenship to tie foreign allies and statesmen to themselves, and to obtain new men for the army and new contributors for the treasury. Regarding immigrants and foreigners, the political problem concerning whether or not to integrate them into the Roman community simply does not arise. All those who can make themselves useful sooner or later become citizens, even slaves. The Roman culture is indeed developed a typical rational and practical approach toward the situation. The advantages of citizenship were offered in exchange for loyalty, alliance, contribution, and military supplies. Unlike how current states are used to granting citizenship today, Rome acknowledged its own interest to grant it, backed by a process of social planning for which immigrants and refugees knew what to do once they entered and what to expect from the authorities if they were to accept the rules of coexistence. In this, the army is an extraordinary tool. Its proverbial operative ability is used as an instrument of social and as well as military management. Everyone, without the extinction of birth or origin, can have a military career and achieve high social status and political command. It establishes an important mechanism of integration. It assimilates immigrants, foreigners, refugees, and barbarians, and after their service, they return to civilian life as Roman citizens. Centuries have passed, yet some writers suggest a sort of a parallelism between the experience in Rome and in the United States of America. Both accept the melting pot as a desirable cultural model. Both use a large and powerful army as a practical route toward citizenship. One can enter regardless of status and exit as citizen. Now, let's propose adding another basic similarity. The American culture, like Roman culture, is well aware that its people are from mixed origins. Therefore, citizenship becomes a political instrument rather than an identifying instrument. Whoever is born in the United States is an American citizen, the so-called full jus soli. It was codified in the American Constitution by an amendment in 1868 oriented towards the protection of the birth rights of slaves of African origin. In spite of the lights and shadows of the fight against racial discrimination that we all know, even this demonstrates that American Constitution's sense of citizenship is to safeguard a coexistence among equals in its community who participate equally in the nation's development. Proof of this is the fact that the application of jus soli is also guaranteed to those born to irregular immigrants on national soil. Regarding the immigration phenomenon, it is noteworthy that, unlike Europe, in the United States, immigrants are not only those who are not citizens, but the green card legally and socially identify them to the eyes of citizens as an aspirant for the condition of citizenship. And the system that allows on an immigrant to become a citizen is naturally inclusive through a relative sponsorship, a job offer, a business investment, a request for asylum, and even in a random way, the famous diversity lottery. For the United States, the problem they are facing is how to balance the initial stages of membership, parity, and integration within a national community where differences in origin are growing. In order to be cohesive with its own constitutional principle, it must choose an integration system that actually facilitated the economic, cultural, and political participation of immigrants, that actually avoid discrimination of immigrants, and that actually keep situation of equality in the communities under control. The Roman Empire had a border, the limes, but it was not a place of rejection, if not in the event of armed warfare. It was a place of meeting, of mutual understanding, of commercial and also cultural exchange. Rome, will, it could not so, never erected the wall to repel migrants and refugees who asked to enter, simply because it would not have done any good to manage this type of inflow. In this sense now, we seek only a reflection that involves its culture as well as its politics. The American dream. What did America represent? for past migrants, and what does it represent still to today migrants? To live better and to survive. An easy but superficial response. It is enough to read pages from assimilated writers or just letters that immigrants wrote at home to understand that this response represents a world where one believes that freedom among equals, equal opportunity, integration through participation in the economic and civil life where they live are all possible. Unlike the United States of America, Europe has not yet defined a concept of European citizenship and a European citizen with a supranational significance. In the old world, each state preserved a concept of its own. What is certain, however, is that to recognize the possession or acquisition of citizenship, everyone must use a combination of legal instruments handed down from tradition. Ius sanguinis, citizenship tied to descent or marriage, with automatic hereditary transmission. Ius soli, citizenship as an automatic consequence of birth, without restriction to lineage, that provides entry from abroad to the community of citizens. Ius domicilii, citizenship tied to continuous residence, subject to a series of regulations with discretional evaluation of identity and non-automatic. Most nations of the European Union favors the acquisition and transmission of citizenship through blood ties. The adoption of blood ties in sanguinis recalls cultural views of an elite character and a cultural heritage of identity protection typical to the culture of nation-states. Identity culture that is expressed in the a priori assignment of a privilege due to a direct line of descent from an original community. However, the exceptions are important, which instead favor the acquisition and transmission of a citizenship by birth, ius soli, such as France, Germany, or Ireland. As we have seen, the model based on birth shows a more open cultural point of view that is functionally oriented toward adapting to the citizens' community at social, political, and economic events. It is in relation to immigration that ius sanguinis and ius soli present the most profound difference, because integrating non-citizens in a system based on the privilege of origin inevitably produces structural inequality and discrimination, which prevents the immigrants from conquering that privilege on their own. Otherwise, being recognized as a citizen and therefore equal to other citizens for the simple fact of being born in a certain territory allows the new citizen to participate in the life of the territory in which they live, and by participating they deserve that status. In our view, the largest structural capacity is precisely the peculiarity of the United States' sense of citizenship compared to the European states in their entirety. A difference in potential that remains even when historic events push the governments of the two continents to similar conduct. Well, what conclusions to draw at the nature of citizenship? We covered its complexity, through which privileges and rights are assigned, and the coexistence among citizens is also regulated. Above all, we understood that it represents a border, subsequent to a material one, but no less decisive and dangerous in relation to migratory phenomenon, because a border can be a place of meeting, but also of definitive exclusion. Zygmunt Bauth writes, that migrants, displaced persons, refugees, etc., are also a metaphor of exclusion and refusal of a society that, too often only in words, has human dignity and its heart. The migrant who does not find their own identity and homeland is similar to waste product. It is type of society that we must avoid in every way going forward. Thank you.
The next speaker is Sonia Diaz Inoa, an Esquire and a PhD holder, and she's from the Pontificia Universidad Católica Madre y Maestra of Santo Domingo. Abra. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us, Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo, at this event. Thank you, Don Mario. This is legal status of person born in the Dominican Republic of undocumented aliens as the entry into force of the law 169/14, which establishes a special regime for persons born in the national territory registered irregularly in the Dominican Civil Register and naturalization. Excuse me.
Next page. Maybe next time.
¿Dónde le voy a dar?
Next page.
And also, you can also use this. Is this what you need?
No, I need the whole.
Yeah, it shows up
Okay.
So-
where do I take the
right here.
Okay.
Or here.
Thank you. Here.
Yeah.
Okay. Sentence 168/13. The culmination of the latent problem in the Dominican society is materialized in the sentence 168 issued by the Constitutional Court on September 23, 2013. Briefly, assimilation of the foreign in transit concept to that undocumented immigrant. This sentence assimilates the concept of foreigners in transit and undocumented aliens without taking into account the time they had living in the country, as in the case of the appellant of the ground of unconstitutionality before the court, whose family has several decades residing in the Dominican Republic, and she and her children were born in the country. Inventory ordered to the Central Electoral Board with retroactive character. In sentence 168, the Constitutional Court ordered the Central Electoral Board to make an inventory of persons registered irregularly in the Civil Register from 1929 to 2007. This decision violates the principle of non-retroactivity of the law enshrined in both in the Dominican Constitution and Civil Code, as the tribunal retroactively applied the current constitution of 2010. Irregularly referred to documents that the parents present in the Dominican Civil Register when they went to register or declare their children as Dominican citizens. This Magna Carta, in its Article 18, consacred the principle of jus sanguinis as a requirement to acquire Dominican nationality, unlike those that precede it contemplating the principle of jus sanguinis and jus soli combined to acquire such nationality. The debate caused by sentence 16A. This judgment affected a considerable number of people. The situation provoked a great national and international debate, attracting the participation of organizations such as United Nations, whose Secretary General visited the Dominican Republic, and regional organizations as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which made an on-site observation visit to the country. Likewise, personality, intellectuals, and academics came forward stating a judgment 16A violated human rights. In the face of this pronouncement, the national and international pressure, the Dominican government tried to find a solution to the serious problem created by the Constitution Court with its ruling. To remedy the situation, Law 169/14 was enacted and established a special regime for people born in the national territory, registered irregularly in the Dominican Civil Register, and naturalization. Law 169 divides the population group affected by sentence 168 into two categories. Group A, consisting of children of undocumented aliens who were registered in the Dominican Civil Register, and Group B, composed of those who were not. This law only partially solved the problem, since although a considerable number of people have benefited from it, a significant part of the affected population has not been able to comply with requirements established by the Central Electoral Board. Immigrant and descendants of immigrant born in the Dominican Republic. Total population of DR, 9.7 million of people, 100%. Born abroad, 524,000, it's 5.4% of the population. Born in DR of immigrant parents, 244,000, it's 2.5% of the population. Total immigrants and descendants, 768,000. It's 8% of the population.